The White Terror of the Norths. In the frozen mountain ranges of Ithris, where the air itself seemed sharpened to a blade's edge and the wind sang dirges through shattered peaks, the albino dragons ruled in silence. The mountains were older than memory. Their jagged crowns pierced the heavens and their slopes were carved by ancient glaciers that had never known thaw. Snow did not merely fall there, it endured. Ice did not melt, it accumulated. Travelers who ventured too close spoke of a presence that pressed upon the chest, as though the land itself were warning them away. Maps labeled the northern range in faded ink. Most bore a single word scrawled across the white expanse: forbidden. The albino dragons were not stories meant to frighten children into obedience. They were not exaggerations born of tavern smoke and ale. They were real, and they were absolute. Their scales were the color of fresh fallen snow, seamless and luminous, reflecting sunlight in blinding brilliance. When they flew, they were indistinguishable from blizzards until the shadows they cast swallowed entire valleys. Their eyes shimmered silver, not metallic, but living, liquid, and ancient beyond comprehension. Entire armies had marched toward Ithris in ages past. None had returned. There were no bones left behind to warn others, no shattered shields, no rusting swords, just absence. The dragons did not rampage. They did not scorch villages for amusement or hunt humans beyond their domain. They simply remained within their mountains, sovereign and untouchable. That restraint made them more terrifying. For centuries, no human had crossed the Frostville Pass and returned alive. The pass was a narrow scar between two towering cliffs of ice-veined stone, perpetually shrouded in mist. Even seasoned hunters avoided it. Even the desperate turned back. Until the day a small child wandered through the snow. She had not meant to trespass upon legend. She had followed something beautiful. Alira was 5 years old, and to her, the world was not a place of borders and warnings. It was a place of wonder. That morning, she had ventured beyond the outskirts of her village, chasing patterns of frost that had formed along the frozen stream. They glittered like tiny stars trapped beneath the ice. She had laughed at the way her breath puffed into clouds before her face. She had delighted in the crunch of snow beneath her boots. The mountains loomed in the distance, pale and vast. She thought they looked lonely. Wrapped in oversized wool that swallowed her small frame and boots that sank deeply into each drift, Alira wandered farther than she had ever been allowed before. The air grew colder, the wind sharper, the trees thinned until only skeletal branches remained, clawing at a bleached sky. She did not feel fear. She felt curiosity. A trail of frost patterns, intricate spirals etched across stone, led toward the Frostville Pass. They shimmered faintly, catching her eye. To an adult, they might have seemed unnatural, deliberate. To Alira, they looked pretty. So she followed. Hours passed, though she did not measure them. The world became white and silver. The wind howled through the pass, carrying a low, resonant hum that vibrated in her chest. It was not sound alone, it was presence. At the summit, the wind died. Abruptly, the silence was immense. Alira blinked snowflakes from her lashes and stepped onto a wide plateau carved from solid ice. The surface shimmered like glass beneath her boots. Then the shadows moved. They were vast, sliding across the snow like living night. The sky dimmed as enormous shapes descended from the clouds, their wings displacing air in thunderous waves that did not quite make sound. 5 albino dragons emerged from the white haze. Their wings spanned wider than castle walls. Their bodies were immense, serpentine, and powerful, muscles coiling beneath pale scales. Frost crystallized around them, drawn to their presence. The temperature plummeted so sharply that the air itself seemed to freeze mid-breath. They landed without roarings. The impact trembled through the ice. At their center stood the largest of them all. His horns curved back like sides of ivory. A ridge of crystalline spines ran down his spine, each shard refracting faint prismatic light. His chest expanded slowly as he inhaled, and when he exhaled, a rolling cloud of freezing vapor spilled across the plateau like a living storm. He lowered his great horned head. Silver eyes, ancient and unblinking, fixed upon the child. Alira looked up. The dragon's gaze was older than empires. It had witnessed civilizations rise in flame and crumble into dust. It had seen kings grovel and heroes charge futilely toward annihilation. It had never looked upon a human child standing alone in its domain without trembling. She did not scream. She did not run. She did not collapse into despair or plead for mercy. She waved. The motion was small, mittened hands swaying cheerfully in the air. "Hello," she called brightly, her voice impossibly tiny against the immensity of stone and scale. "You're very shiny." The wind did not return. The dragons froze. They had expected many things: the scent of terror, the spike of adrenaline, the sour tang of defiance, or the sharp edge of hatred. Instead, the air carried only the warm, unguarded sincerity of a child who had found something fascinating. The smallest of the five, a slender dragon whose horns spiraled delicately like carved ivory, tilted her head. It was a subtle movement. Alira beamed as though she had been granted permission. She took a careful step forward. Snow crunched loudly in the silence. The great dragon's pupils narrowed to slits. Each dragon could feel the others through the subtle vibrations of the ice beneath their claws. They communicated not in words but in shared instinct, in ancient understanding. Humans, alone, fearless. It did not make sense. Do you want to play? Alira asked. The question drifted upward like a fragile thing. Play. The concept did not translate easily into draconic thought. Dragons tested strength, they hunted, they debated territory and philosophy across centuries, they observed the world. They did not play. The mountains waited. The sky itself seemed to hold its breath. Alira shifted her weight, rocking slightly on her heels. She did not interpret the silence as menace. To her, it felt like hesitation. She reached into the pocket of her oversized coat and pulled out something small and round. A wooden ball. It was scratched and imperfect, clearly handmade, perhaps by her father, perhaps by a neighbor. Its surface bore faint carvings worn smooth by small hands. She held it up proudly. I brought this, she announced. It's my favorite. The largest dragon's nostrils flared as he inhaled. The scent was simple: wood, wool, faint traces of hearth smoke. No weapons, no traps. Alira dropped the ball onto the ice. It made a soft clacking sound as it rolled, wobbling slightly before bumping gently against the massive talon of the dragon leader. The scale it touched was thicker than castle gates. Cold radiated from it in waves. The dragon stared down at the object resting against his claw. He could shatter mountains. He could freeze rivers solid with a single breath. The wooden sphere was smaller than one of his teeth. Alira clasped her mittened hands together expectantly. You're supposed to roll it back, she explained. Behind their leader, the other dragons shifted, wings rustling softly. This was unprecedented, absurd, incomprehensible. The great dragon slowly extended a single curved claw. He nudged the ball. Too hard. The ball shot across the ice like an arrow loosed from a bow, skidding wildly before disappearing into a drift of powdery snow. Alira gasped, not in fear but in exaggerated surprise. Oh no, she cried, you're strong. The smallest dragon made a sound. Low, rumblings. The vibration shook frost from nearby rock faces. It took several heartbeats for the others to recognize it. It was laughter. A dragon's laughter was not gentle. It reverberated like distant thunder. Snow cascaded from cliffsides in soft avalanches. The leader blinked. Something unfamiliar stirred within him. He had felt pride, fury, ancient grief, endless patience. This sensation was different. Warm. Alira trudged toward the snowbank, boots sinking deep as she dug for the ball with determined little hands. After a moment, she triumphantly retrieved it and turned back, cheeks flushed pink from cold and excitement. That was too hard, she informed him seriously. You have to be gentle. The word settled over the plateau like a fragile spell. Gentle. The dragon lowered his head further, bringing one immense silver eye closer to her level. The pupil widened slightly as he observed her movements, her unguarded expression, the complete absence of fear. She approached again, fearless as sunrise. This time, when she rolled the ball toward him, she demonstrated with exaggerated care, pushing it slowly so it glided only a short distance. See, she said. The dragon hesitated. Then, with painstaking precision, he extended the very tip of his claw and applied the smallest fraction of force. The ball rolled back. Crooked, slow, but intact. Alira squealed in delight. You did it. The sound pierced something ancient within the gathered dragons. For hours, though none of them would later measure time in the same way, the deadliest beings in the north practiced rolling a wooden toy across ice. The second dragon tried and shattered the ball accidentally, only to recoil as though horrified at himself. Alira stared at the two halves, then nodded decisively. That's okay, we can fix it. She sat cross-legged in the snow, pulling a small piece of twine from her pocket. The dragons watched, mesmerized, as she tied the halves together with clumsy but determined fingers. It was imperfect. It worked. When she slipped on the ice and nearly slid toward a sharp ridge, a massive tail curved subtly, blocking her path without touching her. When the wind returned briefly in a sharp gust, two enormous wings angled to shield her small form from its worst bite. Far below the pass, a scouting patrol from the nearest human kingdom crept upward, having tracked faint disturbances in the snow. They expected devastation. They expected to witness the final moments of some foolhardy traveler. Instead, they reached the edge of the plateau and froze. 5 albino dragons lay upon the ice. And at their center stood a tiny human child, hands planted triumphantly on her hips as she declared, "You're getting better." One of the dragons lowered his head. The child reached up and gently tapped his nose. The patrol fled in stunned silence. Above them, beneath a sky washed pale with cold light, something impossible unfolded. The albino dragons, feared by all, untouchable and eternal, remained where they were. Not because they had been challenged, not because they had been subdued, but because a single human child had looked upon them without fear and asked them to play the game no one expected. The albino dragons were apex predators, but that word did not begin to encompass what they were. They were not merely the strongest creatures in Ithris. They were ancient intelligences shaped by centuries of isolation and survival. They did not simply hunt, they calculated. They did not merely observe, they remembered. Each of them had watched human kingdoms rise like sparks and burn out just as quickly. They had listened to diplomats tremble at the edges of their territory, heard threats disguised as negotiations and promises sweetened with fear. They could taste deceit in the air. They could sense malice in a heartbeat. The human child standing before them carried neither. Illyra trudged closer across the ice, her boots slipping slightly but her balance stubborn and determined. The cold gnawed at her cheeks, turning them pink, and frost clung to the ends of her lashes. Still, her expression held nothing but bright expectation. Clutched between her mittened hands was the small wooden ball. To the dragons, it was an insignificant object, roughly carved, imperfectly shaped, bearing the faint scent of sap and smoke. To Illyra, it was treasure. She crouched, placed it carefully on the ice, and gave it a small push. The ball rolled crooked and slow, spinning uncertainly across the frozen surface. It wobbled as though unsure of its own courage before continuing forward. It reached the immense talon of the lead dragon and tapped against it with the softest click. The sound echoed more loudly in the silence than thunder would have. The dragon lowered his gaze. The sphere rested against a claw capable of splitting stone. He stared at it, then at her. Behind him, the other 4 dragons shifted subtly. Their wings flexed once, sending thin cascades of snow sliding from their membranes. Confusion rippled through their shared awareness. Their kind had negotiated with kings who wore crowns forged in desperation. They had annihilated warbands foolish enough to believe numbers equaled power. They had debated philosophy with elder worms across distant seas, conversing in low vibrations that lasted days. No one had ever offered them a toy. Illyra giggled, rocking back onto her heels. "You're supposed to roll it back," she said, as though explaining an obvious rule to a slow student. The leader of the albino dragons was older than the kingdom that lay south of the Frostville Pass. His name, Veilrith, had once caused generals to abandon campaigns before they began. Entire battalions had retreated at the mere rumor of his shadow crossing the snow. Now he regarded a wooden ball as though it were a complex riddle. Slowly, with a caution he had never exercised in battle, he extended one curved claw. His talon descended toward the sphere. He applied what he believed was minimal force. The ball launched across the ice like a slingstone, spinning wildly as it shot past Illyra. It skidded in a long arc before vanishing into a high drift of loose snow. Illyra gasped dramatically, hands flying to her cheeks. "Oh no," she cried, "you're strong." The words rang with admiration, not accusation. The smallest dragon, a lithe female with spiraling horns and a narrower snout, released a low, rumbling sound deep within her chest. The vibration traveled through the ice, up the cliffs, and into the open sky. For several seconds, the other dragons stiffened, interpreting the sound as a warning. Then they realized. She was laughing. It was not mockery. It was delight. A dragon's laughter was not gentle. It shook frost from overhanging ledges and sent fine snow cascading like glittering rain. The sound rolled outward across the plateau, echoing against distant peaks. Vaelrith blinked. Within his vast chest, something unfamiliar coiled and unfurled. He had known hunger, a sharp, consuming force that demanded satisfaction. He had known dominance, the steady assurance of superiority over challengers. He had known wrath, a cold, methodical destruction unleashed without hesitation. This sensation was none of those. It was a warmth. It spread slowly, unfamiliar and disorienting. The child did not appear intimidated by the thunderous laughter. If anything, she seemed encouraged. She turned, trudging toward the snowbank where the ball had disappeared. Each step required effort, the drift reached nearly to her knees. She plunged mittened hands into the powder and dug with fierce concentration. The dragons watched. They could have located the ball instantly by scent, by subtle shifts in the snow's temperature, by minute disturbances in the ice beneath. Yet none of them moved to assist. They were transfixed. After a moment of determined effort, Alira let out a triumphant little cry and lifted the wooden ball above her head like a victorious hunter displaying prey. Found it. She marched back, snow clinging stubbornly to her boots. That was too hard, she informed Vaelrith solemnly. You have to be gentle. The word settled over the plateau. Gentle? Dragons did not practice gentleness. Their strength was not something they moderated for the comfort of others. It simply was. Vaelrith lowered his head further, bringing one vast silver eye level with the child. The pupil widened slightly as he studied her face. There was no guile in her expression, no trembling fear hidden behind bravado. She regarded him as one might regard a large, slightly clumsy animal in need of instruction. She rolled the ball again, slowly this time demonstrating. See, she said patiently. The ball traveled only a short distance before coming to rest near his claw. Vaelrith exhaled softly, frost curling from his nostrils. He extended the very tip of his talon. He nudged. The ball rolled. It did not shatter. It did not launch into oblivion. It wobbled gently back toward her. Alira's face erupted into radiant joy. You did it. The exclamation rang brighter than any battle cry. Something shifted among the dragons. The second largest dragon, broad-shouldered with thicker horns, leaned forward slightly, curiosity overcoming reserve. His tail twitched, sending a thin crack zigzagging across the ice beneath it. The smallest dragon stepped closer, her head angled inquisitively. Alira retrieved the ball and clapped her mittens together. Again. So they did. At first, the attempts were inconsistent. One dragon misjudged entirely and accidentally split the ball into two uneven halves. The crack sounded sharp and final. The dragon recoiled instantly, pulling back as though he had struck something fragile and alive. Alira stared at the broken pieces in the snow. For a long moment, the plateau fell silent. The dragons waited for tears. For anger. For fear. Instead, Alira crouched and picked up both halves. She examined the fracture thoughtfully. That's okay, she declared at last. We can fix it. She sat cross-legged in the snow, entirely unconcerned with the freezing surface beneath her. From her coat pocket, she retrieved a small coil of twine tangled and frayed at the ends. The dragons watched in rapt fascination as she carefully pressed the two wooden halves together and wrapped the twine around them. Her fingers fumbled in their thick mittens, but she persisted, tongue poking slightly from the corner of her mouth in concentration. It was imperfect. The seam remained visible. But when she set the ball down and pushed it, it rolled. Crooked. Functional. She beamed up at the dragon who had broken it. See all better. The dragon lowered his head slightly, an unconscious gesture of something akin to remorse or perhaps awe. For hours beneath the pale northern sun, the deadliest creatures in the mountains practiced restraint. They learned the precise pressure required to move the ball without destroying it. They adjusted their claws with painstaking care. They compensated for the subtle incline of the ice. They learned. And Alira laughed every time one succeeded. When she slipped unexpectedly on a smooth patch and began sliding toward a sharp drop along the plateau's edge, a massive tail curved instantly across her path. It did not touch her, but it blocked her momentum, allowing her to tumble harmlessly into a mound of snow instead of over the precipice. She did not even notice how close she had come to danger. When the wind rose suddenly, screaming down from the higher peaks in a bitter gust, two enormous wings unfolded instinctively. They formed a living barrier around her small form, absorbing the brunt of the cold. She looked up at the arching membranes above her and grinned. "It's like a tent," she exclaimed. The dragons did not fully understand the word, but they understood the delight behind it. High above the pass, along a narrow ridge overlooking the plateau, a scouting patrol from the southern kingdom finally crept into view. They had followed faint disturbances in the snow, tracks far too small to belong to a warrior. Whispers had reached their captain of a missing child from a village near the forest's edge. They had climbed expecting to find a body. Or worse. The soldiers reached the ridge and peered down. 5 albino dragons lay upon the ice. Alive, alert, and in their midst stood a tiny human child. The largest dragon was reclined slightly on his side, one foreleg extended across the snow. Illyra had climbed onto it using the ridge of his scales like steps. She stood upon his massive foreleg, wobbling slightly as she balanced, and placed both mittened hands against his snout. "Boop," she declared triumphantly. The dragon did not snap. He did not recoil. He did not unleash frostfire. He merely blinked slowly. The soldiers stared, unable to comprehend what they were seeing. One of them dropped his spear. The clatter echoed faintly. Every dragon's head turned in unison toward the ridge. 5 sets of silver eyes locked onto the patrol. The temperature seemed to plummet further. The soldiers felt it then, the true weight of draconic attention. It pressed against their lungs, squeezed their hearts, threatened to unravel their courage entirely. They expected the dragons to rise, to attack, to incinerate them where they stood. Instead, the dragons remained still. Illyra followed their gaze and waved enthusiastically at the distant figures. "Hi," she called, though her voice barely carried. The soldiers did not wave back. They fled. They stumbled over one another in their haste, scrambling down the ridge and disappearing into the white expanse below. By the time they reached safer ground, their breaths came in ragged gasps. They would spread the tale across taverns and courts alike. No one would believe them. Above on the plateau, the game continued. The dragons no longer viewed the wooden ball as an object. It had become something else. A bridge. A symbol of a strange and fragile connection. They did not understand why the child trusted them. They did not understand why her presence did not trigger the instinct to dominate or eliminate. They only understood that when she laughed, something within them shifted. When she smiled at them as though they were not monsters but companions, the mountains seemed less empty. As the pale sun began its slow descent toward the horizon, staining the snow with faint hues of gold and blue, Illyra grew tired. Her movements slowed, her laughter softened into small giggles. She sat down against Veilrith's foreleg, leaning back against the cool but steady warmth radiating from his scales. "I like you," she murmured sleepily. The words were simple. Unadorned. Veilrith lowered his head slightly, positioning it so that his massive form blocked the rising wind from reaching her. The other dragons shifted closer, forming a loose semicircle around the child. None of them spoke. None of them needed to. For the first time in centuries, the albino dragons were not alone in their dominion. And for reasons none of them could yet name, they found that they did not mind. The one they chose. Word spread. It traveled first as a whisper through the village nearest the Frostville Pass, a trembling account from a scouting patrol whose captain swore upon crown and blood that he had seen a child standing unburned among 5 albino dragons. The villagers did not believe him. They could not. The albino dragons were not creatures one stood among. They were calamities given shape. Yet the child in question, Illyra, daughter of a woodcarver and a weaver, returned home at dusk that same day with frost in her hair and stories in her mouth. She spoke cheerfully of big shiny friends and complained mildly that one of them was still bad at rolling the ball. Her parents, pale and shaken, held her tightly that night. They barred the doors. They whispered prayers. They forbade her from wandering again. The next morning she slipped out at dawn. She returned to the mountains. And the next day she went again. Word spread beyond the village. A child had walked into the domain of the White Terrors and lived. A child had played with them. A child had touched the snout of Veilrith, devourer of armies, storm of the pale sky, and survived. Scholars called it impossible. They pored over ancient texts searching for precedent. Some theorized that the dragons were aging and weak. Others suggested illusion, trickery, or collective madness. Generals called it a threat. If the dragons could be distracted, if their attention could be diverted, then perhaps the mountains were vulnerable for the first time in centuries. Plans were drafted in quiet war rooms. Maps were unfurled. Messengers rode between kingdoms under cover of night. Priests called it heresy. Some declared the child chosen by divine will. Others warned she was consorting with demons in scaled form. A few insisted the dragons were testing humanity, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. But the dragons called it something else. Friend. They did not speak the word in any human tongue. They did not carve it into stone or roar it across the peaks. They simply knew it. Illyra returned the next day with a small basket hanging from her arm. Inside were honey cakes slightly crushed, wrapped in cloth. She climbed the Frostville Pass with determination and arrived on the plateau flushed with triumph. The dragons were waiting. They had sensed her approach long before she crested the ridge. They recognized the rhythm of her footsteps, the lightness of her presence. The ice beneath the mountain seemed to hum differently when she drew near. Vaelrith stood at the edge of the plateau, wings half furled, silver gaze fixed on the path. When she appeared, she waved enthusiastically. "I brought snacks," she announced. The word meant little to them, but the scent carried sweetness. She sat cross-legged before them and carefully unwrapped a honey cake. She held it up toward Vaelrith's enormous face. "You can't eat it in one bite," she warned seriously. The dragons understood tone, if not vocabulary. Vaelrith lowered his head, nostrils flaring as he inhaled the scent. He extended the very tip of his tongue and delicately took the honey cake from her hand. He could have swallowed her whole without effort. Instead, he chewed slowly. The cake vanished in an instant regardless, but the gesture was careful. Illyra clapped. "See, good job." The other dragons watched with restrained fascination. One by one, she offered them pieces. Some accepted, others merely observed. Afterward, she launched into stories. They were not grand tales of heroes or kingdoms. They were fragments of childhood imagination. She spoke of a neighbor's cat who thought it was a king. She described how her father carved little animals from wood and how she was learning to sew uneven stitches like her mother. She sang half-remembered songs, often forgetting the words midway and replacing them with humming. The dragons listened. They had debated philosophy with elder worms whose thoughts spanned centuries. They had contemplated the formation of glaciers and the migration of stars. Yet this earnest rambling of a 5-year-old human held them rapt. When she asked why dragons did not build snowmen, the question sparked a moment of collective pause. "What's a snowman?" Vaelrith rumbled, his voice a deep vibration that rolled across the ice. Illyra gasped in exaggerated disbelief. "You do know." She leapt to her feet and began gathering snow into a lumpy mound. The dragons watched as she stacked 2 uneven spheres atop one another. "It's like a person," she explained, patting the sides into shape, "but made of snow and you give it a face." She searched her pockets and produced 2 small pebbles and a twig. With intense concentration, she pressed the pebbles into the upper sphere and stuck the twig beneath them. "There," she declared proudly. The result was crooked, unstable, and undeniably charming. The dragons regarded the tiny snowman in silence. Then the smallest dragon stepped forward. With precise, almost reverent care, she used the flat of her claw to push an enormous mass of snow into place beside Illyra's creation. She shaped it gently, sculpting a towering version of the same figure. Another dragon used a claw tip to carve delicate lines for eyes. Vaelrith himself nudged 2 boulders into position for the larger snowman's arms. Within the hour, the plateau held an entire procession of snow figures, some clumsy, some surprisingly intricate, ranging from child-sized to dragon-sized. Illyra spun in a delighted circle. "You made a family," she exclaimed. The dragons did not understand the word fully, but they understood her joy. When she laughed, the mountains seemed less cold. It was not a physical warmth, the air remained sharp, the snow remained unyielding. Yet something in the vast silence shifted. For centuries, the albino dragons had existed in austere isolation. Their interactions were measured and restrained, bound by ancient customs and territorial instincts. Now there was laughter on the plateau. Now there were crooked snowmen. Now there was a small human who did not flinch when silver eyes fixed upon her. One afternoon, as pale sunlight spilled across the ice in muted gold, Alira approached Vaelrith with unusual seriousness. "I need to tell you about tea parties," she said. Vaelrith lowered his head to listen. She described them with great enthusiasm: small cups, pretend pouring, polite conversation, and sometimes stuffed animals as guests. The dragons had no concept of porcelain or etiquette. Yet as she spoke, gesturing animatedly, they leaned closer. Ancient beings who had seen civilizations rise and fall listened with rapt attention to a child explaining imaginary tea. At the end of her explanation, she folded her hands primly in her lap. "And then you say, 'Thank you for coming,'" she concluded. Vaelrith regarded her for a long moment. Then, in a voice like distant thunder softened by snowfall, he said, "Thank you for coming." Alira squealed and threw her arms around his snout. No human army had ever survived his fury. His name had once been synonymous with annihilation. Yet he lowered his massive head without hesitation so she could hug him. Her arms did not reach halfway across his muzzle. Still, she squeezed with all her might. Vaelrith closed his eyes. If any threat had emerged in that moment, any arrow loosed from afar, any blade raised in secret, the mountains themselves would have shattered beneath his wrath. He would have torn the sky apart before allowing harm to reach the small creature who had offered him a wooden ball without fear. Far below the Frostville Pass, kingdoms debated strategy. Spies reported that the dragons seemed distracted. Some argued this was the opportunity they had awaited for generations. If the beast's attention could be divided, perhaps a coordinated assault might succeed. Others warned that provoking creatures of such power was folly. They did not understand. The albino dragons had not grown weaker. They had grown invested. There was a difference. One evening, as the sun bled gold across the snow and the sky deepened into violet twilight, Alira's energy finally waned. She had spent the day teaching the dragons how to draw shapes in the snow with careful claw marks. She had attempted to climb onto a lower ridge before being gently blocked by a massive tail. She had sung until her voice turned hoarse. Now she sat against Vaelrith's foreleg, her back resting against the smooth, cool scales. The dragon adjusted slightly, angling his body to shield her from the wind. Her eyelids drooped. "You're warm," she murmured sleepily. Dragons were creatures of frost and ice. Their breath could freeze rivers. Yet beneath their scales, ancient heat coiled, a core of power and life. Vaelrith let that warmth surface subtly, enough to keep the cold from biting too deeply. Alira curled closer and fell asleep. The dragons did not move. One by one, they shifted into position around her. Not as jailers, as guardians. Their bodies formed a protective ring, wings overlapping slightly to create a barrier against wind and snow. Silver eyes scanned the horizon in every direction. Night settled over Ithris. Stars emerged sharp and brilliant against the dark. Far below, torches flickered in distant watchtowers as human sentries kept nervous vigil. On the plateau, 5 albino dragons kept their own vigil over a sleeping child. They understood something humanity did not. They had not been conquered. They had not been tamed. They had been reached. The difference was profound. To face a dragon's wrath was to confront devastation. To threaten something a dragon loved was to invite extinction. For the first time in recorded history, the White Terrors had something beyond territory. They had someone. And as Vaelrith lowered his head slightly, ensuring his wing cast a final shield against the creeping night wind, a silent truth settled over the mountains. The peaks of Ithris would never belong to humanity. Not because the dragons were feared, but because they had chosen. And dragons, once they chose, did not waver.